A warm welcome to this week's lecture of the Europe on the Edge program. We are Bart and Katharina, and we are the research officers at the Sharing Perspectives Foundation. It is a great pleasure for us to be able to present to you some of our preliminary findings from the survey data that you collected. You might recall the survey is trying to get a better understanding how young people in Europe understand the concept of citizenship. In the survey, we included a whole list of questions on traditional citizenship activities such as voting, but also had a whole set of questions on activities that we were curious to know whether young people in Europe would consider those activities to be activities of citizenship or not. The questions on social media, for example, were among those. Not surprisingly, the data offers us with a lot of information that unfortunately we won't be able to cover here in our lecture. So we decided to go ahead with two topics that we found particularly interesting and inspiring, and we hope that's going to be the same for you, and you'll enjoy discussing those topics in your groups as well. So let's focus on our first topic, the issue of caring and acting. So the issue of political apathy is probably something that you have heard about before as well in other lectures or in even in everyday life. We also had it covered here in last week's lecture of the Europe on the Edge program, the lectures of Doro Francesco and Annalisa Frestina, which you probably also discussed in last week's discussion groups as well. So we want to dig into this topic because it is our impression that young people are, like yourselves, are in fact pretty active in a variety of activities that often have some sort of political or societal connotation to it. And in fact, obviously, there are a whole bunch of articles written on youth participation or political apathy among youth. And if you are interested in this topic, we strongly encourage you or recommend that you take a look at this literature as well and see for yourselves what is being written on there. In fact, in the paper that we are providing here for our lecture this week, you'll find some references that you might find useful as well. Okay, but time is of the essence in our talk, so let's have a look at the data and take a look at our at the slide that is coming up on the interest in politics. Just for your information, you'll have a version of our script here as well that will provide you with some more statistical information on the respective things that we're going to cover here in the lecture. But for this lecture or for the time being, we're just going to keep it in rather simple terms so that everyone can easily follow it. Okay, but interest in politics. So as you can see on the slide. Young people are, in fact, pretty interested in politics. The survey showed a solid majority of people being interested in politics, following political news, or discussing politics with family and friends. So this is very promising. However, just being interested in politics might not actually suffice to participate. So let's have a bit of a closer look at what the data is telling us, to what extent young people in Europe believe that political participation is something important, something that citizens should be active in. So if you have a look at the next slide, what we see here is to what extent young people in Europe appreciate what is being called democratic values. So there is an overwhelming majority of young people believing that citizens should vote. The majority of people also believes that citizens should engage in the majority, and nearly half of the respondents said that it is very important for the citizens to engage in politics. Interestingly, we have around 73% of the respondents saying that politics should not just be left to politicians. If we were to interpret this notion, this might call for something like that young people in your belief that there should be some more plurality among the political actors in plurality in the landscape of political actors. So being interested in politics and holding the democratic values dear sounds very promising. So actually, is this notion of a political apathetic youth too gloomy after all? Let's take a closer look at what the data is telling us in this regard. So are those, for example, who believe that it is important for a citizen to vote actually going out to vote? I think, Bart, you have some more information on that.
Thank you, Katharina. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the sound. Now and again you might hear large gusts of wind because it's a bit stormy out here today, so I hope that won't be too distracting. Anyway, yes, as far as voting is concerned, there is actually a large association between the believed importance of voting and actually voting in a national election. We also know from our survey that the voting turnout is actually quite high. 77% indicated that they voted in the last national election, which is quite a lot higher than the actual turnout of the election. So we're going to have to look into that deeper, but it is very promising for the youth in Europe because a large portion of our sample is very young. Voting, however, might be a special case, as elsewhere by Kammerts and his colleagues, for example. They showed that despite all the apathy claims, voting is still believed to be at the core of the democratic process by many. So how does the situation look for community engagement? Because we know engaging in the community is believed to be something important for citizens to do as well. Well, there is a significant association between the believed importance for a citizen to engage in the community and the actual engagement in the community. Engagement here refers to unorganized help in the neighborhood, cultural organizations, university groups, religious groups, the likes. The odds of somebody engaging in a community is 2.3 times higher if they believe it's also important. So if you believe it's important, you're way more likely to actually go out and do something, which is a very positive thing, I believe. One curious fact to look at on the slide in front of you might be that 5.5% of the respondents find it not important to engage in the community, but are still very active in the community. So that's a very interesting one to look at, and one, well, which raises many questions in my mind. Now, the next thing we'll be looking at is engaging in politics. This is also believed to be very important for citizens, as we saw during Katharina's talk. And if people think they should be active in politics, let's see if they actually are. Well, indeed, there's also a significant relation between the believed importance for citizens to engage in politics and the actual engagement in protest and social change. Protest and social change here refers to working for an NGO, signing a petition, taking part in protest, or consuming ethically. The odds of somebody doing this is 3.4 times higher if they believe it's important for citizens to engage in politics than not. Again, there's a little weird thing going on in the percentages where 6.7% of the people find it not important but still do it frequently. There's also a significant association between the believed importance for a citizen to engage in politics and the actual engagement in a political party. The odds of somebody engaging in a political party frequently is 3.3 times higher if they believe it's also important to engage in politics.
So we'll just heard from Bart how the how this is reflected in our data. So the notion whether people who find it important to engage actually engage in, for example, the community or politics, or in a political party, for example. So something that we were wondering about, and this is something that we would like to propose for you as a discussion question in your groups, is why don't more young people engage? Because what we just saw is that there are a lot of people who find engaging important, but don't actually act on this belief. So what motivates young people at the end of the day to engage? You might recall from last week the lecture of Vote Watch, where Dora Frantescu was arguing that there is this lack of institutions, or the perception of not being heard by young people, or the fact that, or the perception rather, that political parties don't have a clear profile, which keeps young people away from political engagement. However, what we would like to propose here, and give you a little bit of food for thought, is to look at it through either a bit of a more psychological lens, or a bit of a structural lens. So I would like to suggest or propose to look at the issue of motivation or not being motivated to engage from a bit of a more psychological approach. And I think what might be a valuable theory to look at is social determination theory. Social determination theory scholars see motivation on a continuum from not being motivated whatsoever to extrinsic motivation, that where people act because they either receive some sort of awards or rewards, or where people believe that they should adhere to certain norms, up to a real intrinsic motivation where you do something because you really enjoy that particular activity. So the theory sees that, or believes that there are three basic needs that are, interestingly enough, valid across culture, and that would, if met, motivate a person to initiate action. And these needs are competence. So I need to feel competent at a particular action that I'm planning to do. I need to feel some sort of autonomy. So autonomy here means that I have a desire to feel effectual control over my actions, and I need to feel something that's being called relatedness. So I need to have this, need to feel connected to others. So people who are motivated to do anything, so people who are not motivated to do anything whatsoever, they don't feel competent at it. They don't value the particular activity, and they don't believe that their actions would yield to a particular outcome. So the logic then would be that if those needs are actually met, then this would motivate more people to initiate a particular action. Another psychological explanation that I would like to propose to look at is that people sometimes engage for either altruistic reasons or egoistic reasons. So egoistic reasons might be, for example, I engage because I believe it's important for my career, or for self-enhancement, so that I feel better about myself. Interestingly enough, altruistic reasons are not necessarily better reasons, quote unquote, when it comes to the question of how long a person engages, because research actually has shown that even people who are motivated for egoistic reasons are actually committing to voluntary engagement, for example, in the long term. So my question would be, so with regards to the social determination theory, should or do politicians need to create some sort of environment where these needs of competence, autonomy, and relatedness are met? Or if you look at it from the altruistic and egoistic motivation, should politicians, in order to get more young people to engage, appeal to either an altruistic motivation or an altruistic side or an egoistic side in us, in order to get young people to participate in the democratic process? Bart, what do you think?
Well, I'm not so sure about that, although there's very much to say for a psychological approach, especially when it comes to motivating people for political engagement. When we look at it from a more structural point of view, for instance from Sidney Terra's political opportunity structure, we come to some different conclusions. Now, political opportunity structures is used all over social sciences, mostly for social movements, protests, riots, and political participation, also in democracies. And it proposes that we need three conditions to be met in order to come to action. There needs to be consciousness or grievances of deprivation, so there needs to be something which needs to change. This seems obvious, but it does need to happen. A second thing that you need is organizational strength. I.e., you need strong leadership, you need sufficient resources, you need a network, you need perhaps a youth program, a political party, something in order to drive the protest, people who will show up, people who will call you out of bed when you need to show up somewhere. And the third thing, and perhaps most importantly and often overlooked, is that you need to have political opportunities, i.e. the political system needs to be vulnerable to change. So there needs to be some sort of power imbalance that can change. There needs to be something that can be either gained or lost for somebody, of which a movement can make use. So, for instance, you see these political opportunities when movements try to associate themselves with a political party, or a political party with a movement that's popular enough. Someone sees that there is an opportunity to gain power, and they need to seize that. However, I think this is up for discussion, and I think it might be best if the students discuss this further.
Well, that's actually a very fair point. So some inspiration for you guys, and hopefully you'll find it inspiring enough to initiate a bit of a discussion in your groups as well. Okay, so we have some more issues that we wanted to point out to you guys in this lecture as well. Another topic that we found particularly interesting is the issue of offline versus online engagement. So the question of whether people who engage offline would also engage online, or people who don't get engaged offline would then engage online in a political way. If you recall last week's lectures, you probably remember that there was a bit of a hope presented that the internet or the social media would actually be quite beneficial and helpful for promoting political participation among young people. And in fact, the issue of the internet and social media and getting more young people to engage in politics through social media, for example, is something that that has been covered fairly extensively in the literature already. And in fact, particularly if you look at earlier studies, you can see that there were quite a lot of hopes for the internet and social media in particularly to have some sort of an equalizing effect on political participation, meaning that social media, and that was the hope, social media would allow and enable those who didn't previously participate in politics to actually now engage into the in the political process. However, as you can imagine, this has been contested already, and there is fairly quite some skepticism, and there's fairly some skepticism on this notion whether the online crowd who engages or politically is actually so much different from the offline crowd that engages or that shows a political engagement. So what does our data have to say for this? So in fact what we are able to see at the moment is that there is a significant association between people engaging in protest and social change activities. So this would be, for example, participating in a demonstration or signing a petition or boycotting a particular product or ethical consumption, for example, and the use of social media for political purposes, for creating and promoting political content in particular. So people who engage in protest and social change activities have a 5.1 bigger likelihood of using social media for creating and promoting political content than those people who don't engage in protest and social change activities. So we started talking about the issue of social media, and it is actually the second topic that we wanted to suggest that you discuss in your groups this week, because social media has gotten a fair amount of attention when it comes to the issue of or different concepts of citizenship and obviously through that political participation. So the issue of social media and political engagement became very, very prominent during the times of the Arabic revolutions in 2010. The massive usage of social media at that time gave rise to the hope that social media or these new technologies might enhance political participation and even or possibly promote the idea of democracy. There were in fact media outlets who would refer to the revolution as a Twitter revolution, even though technically they should have called it a second Twitter revolution, because these same outlets had already named a revolution in Iran from the previous year a Twitter revolution. So Twitter revolution or not, it is probably not so difficult to see where this hope of social media enhancing political participation is coming from, because the underlying assumption here is that social media and the internet is widely spread. Young people have comparatively good access to it. It would be easier for them to engage politically because it is easier to do so than engaging in offline activities such as a demonstration, because it requires the offline mode of engagement requires more efforts. This would not just be the case for young people living under authoritarian regimes, but also in democratic states. So in fact, the research team around Howard showed that social media was heavily used by the key demographic group of the revolution, so which were young, well-educated, urban individuals who used social media in order to put their governments under pressure to shape the public debate or to publish critical information on their governments. So in fact, from their point of view, social media actually played a quite critical role during the revolution. So the study by Howard and others referred to the situation of the Arabic Revolution in particular. But there are obviously also researchers, and I think this is fairly interesting, who would argue that social media actually has quite some impact on political participation also in Western societies. The team around Zanos and others argued that even if young people don't engage in politics and through social media or are not actively looking for political information on social media or elsewhere, even if they are just by coincidence are exposed to political information, that this actually might lead to some form of political engagement. And I think this is actually a fairly promising outlook to what role social media plays. What do you think, Bart? Social media? Is it worth it?
Social media, let's all hope it's our great savior, but there are, of course, as always, opposing voices. For the Arab Spring, for instance, Wolfsveld and colleagues found that the protest in general seemed to predate the increased social media activity. So instead of being a driving force behind the protest, they see social media as a tool that can sustain it, along with other tools of communication. You also have researchers like Bakker and Scholzman and colleagues who call for mindfulness. In their studies, they found that both offline and online political participation are highly related to the socio-economic status of people. The higher the socio-economic status, the more educated they are, the richer their parents are, the richer they themselves are, the more likely these people are to use their leisure time for online political participation. This relationship between socioeconomic status and political participation contrasts the notion that access to the internet would automatically include more people. It's essentially the usual suspect. This critique is in line with the findings of Norris, who argues that although social networks may sustain and facilitate collective action, it's only one channel of communications amongst many. In other words, the social networks that are represented on social media are already present in other parts of life. If we look back at the example of the Arab Spring, for instance, and particularly at Egypt, one of the driving forces during those protests was the Muslim Brotherhood, who had already existed since 1928. So in that sense, it's a case of nothing new under the sun, maybe. As far as our own findings go, these seem to be cause for skepticism on the role of social media. First, the number of people who were politically active on social media wasn't very high. And second, and perhaps most damning, is that we also find that it's the usual suspects. The very large overlap between the people who are politically engaged online and offline does seem to confirm this. Although, to be fair, a very good question might be, would these people be politically engaged if they weren't politically engaged online? Unfortunately, we don't have the answer to that, but what do you guys think? We'd like to leave you with that today, and thank you very much for your attention, and we hope you guys have a great discussion. Katharina?
Yeah, thank you very much from my side as well, and I hope that you enjoyed our lecture. Enjoy your discussions this week.